Good morning, and thank you for coming. As you are probably aware, we are here for the final defense, dissertation defense of Colleen McDonald Morgan, better known as Cali Anicha. And with that, I do want to make a couple announcements, or go over a couple things first. My name is Chris Ray, and I am Cali's advisor. I've been working with her since she started the program a couple years ago. Really quickly, just so you are aware, we are recording this presentation using Integrity, so we will have a link available if anybody wants to see the presentation afterwards.
Hi, Mom and Dad.
With that, we would like to go around the room really quickly and do introductions of the people that are here in the room. So I'm going to switch the camera around, and we'll start with Liz.
My name is Liz Rommel, and I'm one of the committee members for Cali's.
I'm Jonna Bland Green. I'm also one of the committee members of Cali's community.
I'm Nate Wood. I'm also one of the committee members.
Kelly Nelson, student in the EVP.
Claudia Peterson, I teach in the Education Doctoral Program.
Clayton Hilmert, I'm from the Department of Psychology, and I'm one of the committee members.
I'm Min from Newsland and Khalid's partner, so be nice to her.
I'm Rebecca Gardner. I'm a friend of Khalid's and have a professional interest in this topic as well.
I'm Sherry Lee Short, and I can echo what Rebecca said. I'm a friend, and I also have a personal and professional interest in this.
My name is Zubaid. I'm from Saudi Arabia. I'm in the Occupation and Education.
My name is Sarah Ajlan. I'm also in adult education.
And I don't believe we have anybody joining us from a distance. So, with that, just want to quickly go over the structure. Here in just about a minute, Cali is going to begin with her presentation, which will be about 45 to 50 minutes. We will then have public questions and answers. The committee will largely wait and ask questions after we go into a closed meeting, which will be about 11 to 12. So with that, if you have not yet done it, because you forget like I do, make sure to silence your cell phone. And with that, without further ado, I will turn it over to Cali.
Okay, so the image on the screen, the background slide, is of a spiral-bound notebook, and this is a slide background that signals a new section. Of course, this is the beginning section. The title of my dissertation, Mainstreaming Critical Disability Studies towards Undoing This Last Prejudice. A little bit about how I came to be here. I want to start with acknowledgments, with thanks and appreciation for family and friends and my committee members and colleagues and everybody who has made it here today, and very special thanks to Dr. Ray, because without him I would not be standing here for sure. And then a very special thanks also to the Forward Initiative, because Forward supported me in a graduate assistantship over the last several years and really made this work possible, and much of what I'll share with you today is grounded on the work, the very important work they're doing, and I'm so glad to have gotten to participate in that. I will also take just a moment to make a point about the importance of theory, which I'll be talking fairly extensively about through the talk today. And I'll do it by recognizing that we are all located on lands that were taken from the original inhabitants by our forebears, some of our forebears, who used the theory of manifest destiny to guide their actions. And so, of course, the consequences of that live on today. And so the theory I'm talking about also may have some consequences. That's my hope. Also, how I came to be here. Calm down a little. Public school teacher. I'm very invested in public school. And public school being a very important place where we can operationalize our hopes for justice in the world, make it real in our lived experiences. So I came to this graduate program to my graduate education overall looking for research skills. I think I've gained a lot, and I still have a lot to learn. And so my hope for this, my intention for this time together is that we all leave feeling better prepared, perhaps to either continue the work that we've already been doing with some new ideas and new approaches, or if this is all new, to have a sense of what we can do as individuals in our institutions as well. So, a little overview of the 45 minutes. Start with describing my disorienting dilemma that was precipitated by the work that I was doing with the Forward program, and then has also precipitated this dissertation work. Then describe a very useful framework, what I found to be a very useful framework to address that dilemma. And then the research study that I undertook for this, and some ideas for applying the findings, and a little bit about, so what do we do with that, and hopefully that'll be sometime between 10:45 and 10:50, and we'll have time for comments and questions. So, I start with a famously used quote by Muriel Rukeyser. "The universe is made up of stories, not of atoms." And when I first heard that, I thought, well, that's quaint. I bet those language arts teachers really love that. And I tucked it away. When I'm teaching reading or writing, I'm going to use that quote. But the longer I've been in live and in education, I've realized how very many truths are held in that quote. So, image on the screen is now a background of scientific chemical notation and a marble of the planet Earth. And I paraphrase Rukeyser, "Our universe is made up of stories and of atoms." So, I will begin this with my disorienting dilemma, that my story and the image on the screen is the Earth turned upside down. The story of how my world was turned upside down. This talk will then include also my responses to that disorienting dilemma. To begin, though, I want to make sure that we have shared meaning for the language I'll be using, because I've had 6 years of having my head in some very particular literatures, and so I'm using a lot of terms that have become very familiar to me, but aren't familiar typically, and that I actually don't use in a lot of my day-to-day conversations. So, what you see on the screen now is what's traditionally called the bell curve, also called the normal distribution curve, also called the Gaussian curve, Gaussian distribution. So I'll be using those terms interchangeably as I go. Just to back up a bit, so in the screen you see the middle section is shaded a bit. This is the average section. So under the curve we have a number of quantified aspects to the area under the curve, and then there is the qualitative assessment of that quantification. So we have below average, average in that midsection, and above average. And what has happened culturally is that we have come to equate that average with what is normal, and normal with what is good. So there's the rub, right? There's a bit of a problem there. And so when we come to this idea of disability, it's a word I can't use anymore without having many, many definitions in my mind and many ideas about what's appropriate about how to use that word. So I'll be saying things like perceived as disabled, or perceptions of disability, or status with regard to, or what we've come to call disability. I'll thank my friend Carol for that. Also in the U.S. we've been taught very specifically to use what is called person-first language, and so we say person with a disability. In the U.K., a quite different piece, it's disabled. It's more appropriate to say I'm a disabled person, because disabled actually points to the social systems. And Margaret Price, who visited us here through the Forward program in her book over here, Mad at School, had a conversation with a colleague in the UK, pardon me, asking her, what was that about? And the colleague said to her, I would no more say I have a disability than I would say I have a racism. So that the term disabled points to the disabling social system in the UK. Pardon me. I do have water, but I'm kind of afraid I'll pour it on myself. So take a drink here. Okay. Another set of terms that I've come to use is species typical and species atypical. And this comes from the literatures in critical disability studies areas. And I use it primarily to help myself move away from this idea that average and normal are equal to good. So that there's just a whole other way of thinking about this. And so I'll be sprinkling my talk with species typical, species atypical. And this is what I'm referring to as a way of understanding ourselves is, yes, we have some very usual ways that we show up. Most of us walk. Most of us are somewhere between 5'2" and 5'8". Most of us have shoe sizes of certain, etc. There are absolutely ways that this makes sense and is reflected in our direct experience. And it also has become associated with the whole paradigm or way of seeing the world that I want to move away from. So that's language I've come to use. And then another pair of words, enabled privilege and conscientization. So enabled privilege refers to the way that the world is set up so that I just don't have to think about it. So as a walker, when I encounter stairs, I am not denied access. I just take the stairs. And that privilege is often quite invisible to me. And that invisibility then brings us to this idea of conscientization, which is critical awareness or waking up to the systems that are unearned advantaging and unearned disadvantaging that keep the status quo of discriminations, various discriminations in place, and then finding my place in that. Where's my position? Am I in a overprivileged? Am I in an underadvantaged place? Where's my place there? So critical awareness about where am I in this system. And then universal design is another set of terms. And universal design refers to creating environments, classes, coursework, etc., to the greatest extent possible to be accessible to the widest representation of folks, species typical and species atypical folks who show up and want to access that curriculum or environment. So I am describing the images on the screen. That's part of that attempting to provide more accessibility. So if someone had a vision impairment, they would be able to also know what the visual information on the screen is. So here's an example of universal design, sort of. So when I first saw this, I thought, wow, look what we can do when we put our minds to designing stairways that include ramps, right? The images of stairways with a ramp integrated right into it. However, this is on reddit.com. I read some of the comments, and a wheelchair user said, wee, it's marble madness, and wheelchair users are the marbles. And some comments about how, well, there's, where are the railings? What if it's icy? What if I'm tippy? Right? So the idea with universal design that's very important is that there is collaboration and consultation with the folks who we're designing for, which is all of us, right? And so I don't know the backstory here, so it may be that that indeed there was consultation on this, and this was decided as, hey, better than no access, right? Maybe that was the deal, but it serves as a good metaphor, analogy, example that I'll be referring to as we go along in the talk. So back to my dilemma, my very disorienting dilemma. So again, the images of the earth turned upside down. And as I worked with the Forward group, I was asked to investigate the experiences of faculty with disability and to investigate some responses that we could take institutionally to make equity more the name of the game. And this really led me to a number of new awarenesses. The prevalence of disability discrimination, the depth and breadth and problem of it was something that I'd only had a little bit of a notion of, but really getting into the specifics was unnerving for me personally, too bad, but also came across the field of critical disability studies, or also known as disability studies. And having been a special education teacher for 20 years, the whole of which and beyond this discipline had been alive and well, disability studies, and I had never heard of it. And I had a master's in special education. That was pretty shocking. Coming from this P12 elementary and some secondary education and learning about these negative consequences of being identified as disabled, and that was the job I was doing. I was identifying kids as eligible for, meeting criteria for, they were disabled enough to get into a program so that we'd give them special education. And so this idea that I was creating, perpetuating, and getting paid for, this stalled me out for a while. So I had a great friend who said, well, you know what happens to people when they come across privilege that they've had all along and they suddenly wake up to it? You can get really mired in privilege guilt. You can get stuck there. You can want to confess to everybody, try to, get it off your chest. Don't stay there too long. Do the processing you need to do, but come on, you want to get busy here. There's stuff to do. So, to back up a little bit about what precipitated this dilemma, as I looked at this across the planet, really, that contemporary societies across the globe, almost all, not all, but almost all, are reporting or being reported as having a discriminatory approach to identification, perceptions of disability, that there's a problem there. So what does that look like? Well, what it looks like is that there's very serious under or unemployment, and so people who are perceived as having a disability or disabled are living in poverty. Also, hate crimes against people who are perceived to be disabled are more frequent. And of course, when economic conditions get worse, everybody whose perception or everybody who lands on the side of difference as not good gets it a little harder, right, in the cultural experience. There's also lots of restrictions and exclusions from educational and social opportunities for people perceived as having a disability. So in terms of the exclusion piece, I imagine, and this is in one of the blogs I read, you wouldn't go into a restaurant if it said whites only. You'd never do that. But would you go into a restaurant that you had to get to through stairs? Totally. Do it fairly often, right? We don't say, I'm not going to eat there because there's no access, physical access for somebody using wheeled mobility. And then there's social stigma that comes with this perception of, you're that kind of person, and I'll talk more about that. And the isolation that happens from the restrictions, the exclusions, and that kind of social response too. So there I was, recognizing that my role as a special education teacher really started that process. Got it going. I said, yep, you're disabled. I'll sign here. So the critical disability studies perspective was saying to me, this is unnecessary. These harms come from a worldview that sees disability as average normal good, outside of average normal good. And you can shake that up. You can have a different view of the world and understand things differently, and that really matters. So what could I do about that? I wrote an article. And so Article 1 is, again, this is the image of a spiral-bound notebook signaling shift to a new approach here. Sorry, I'll go backwards. Conscientization, so this critical awareness is what I'm suggesting is the response for the 21st century for educational reform. That's what we need to do. We need to become aware of enabled privilege. So I framed this as an open letter to my colleagues and hoped that a very narrative approach saying here was my experience to this wider set of social systems that are creating harms this is what happened for me, in the hopes that folks who, like me, are educators but haven't had the time to look deeply into this would read that and say, wow, we have to talk about this. We have to think differently about this and start those conversations. So that was the intent of this first article. And there is an image of a person sitting at a desk handwriting a letter. Image on the screen again is of the normal bell-shaped Gaussian distribution curve. And in this article, I started by really recalling the ways that I was taught to see students almost singularly through this lens, this Gaussian lens, right? That they came with certain abilities, and those were stable qualities that I could just expect there's going to be a bunch in the average and maybe a bright one or two and a few over here. And that's just what they were going to come in with. And then any testing that I did, I could expect that stable intellectual capacity to be reflected there. So before I got here to graduate education, I already had seen how problematic that idea was, because students came having had a really rough morning, and that impacted their performance. Students came having had a series of really rough mornings or a series of really great mornings, and that impacted their performance. Students came feeling really welcomed to the school or really not welcomed. Students came from families who felt really welcomed in the community or really not welcomed in the community. So there are all these ways that this was not mapping onto my experience of what I could expect to see from kids. So I already had some looking askance at this when I got to my graduate education. And then, as I looked at the critical disability studies lens, there was the articulation of this average equals normal equals good. And what that means is, outside of that, we have other characteristics. We have other ways of identifying, right? And so disability became associated with defect, and defect became a metaphor for flaws in character, immorality, amorality, even evil. And so if you imagine the media that you've seen, starting with children's media, Captain Hook, and then just think about the many times that movie art will use a patch or a limp or a hunchback or a mental illness to signal to you quickly, there's something really wrong here. There's something really amiss. So that is an ongoing trick of media that's used very often, and it's based on this idea that this species atypicality on this left wing of the curve is a negative, it's a problem. So critical disability studies also helped me understand the way that seeing kids through this lens actually created and motivated, maintained disability discrimination. Another piece that the critical disability studies talked about was that there's this idea that the idea of disability, or a defective human, is the ground upon which all other ideas of racism, sexism, genderism, etc. start. And there's some good historic evidence for that. Women are seen as the non-standard man, the weaker sex, right? That there's a standard, and then there's the less than. So sexism has been grounded in a sense of a defective man. Similarly with race, there's been a racialized discourse around, well, let's just do all these measurements and see how this person with this wider lips or broader nose has, that's equated with a defect in some way, and that is related to this other discourse about other racialized characteristics. So we certainly have used the tools of science to support these paradigms. So I got to this point where I had to say, well, what if I had to admit this, that really it was true, that disability is this place, and I'm participating in it, and I'm getting paid for it. That was a really big deal. I can't go back to work. But I did decide to go back to work, because after processing that, privilege guilt I said, well, what can I do? What can I do? I can use the conceptual tools that I've been handed in my graduate education. And I could theorize disability differently. And especially in theorizing it differently, I could shift my attention from those disabled people to those enabled people. Look at the, take the privileged turn, so to speak, and look at what's keeping the system in place. So this is where the very useful framework that I mentioned comes in. And again, the spiral-bound notebook, a very useful framework. And how does that work? This slide I will skip over very quickly. It's just to show that I was challenged to take all the tools I've been offered and create an elegant framework. So I don't know about elegant, but it's much more simple to look at here. And so the image now is 3 circles that are labeled with the concepts that I'll discuss, and they are superimposed on another circle. These are the tools I have come to think with about disability. So to unpack these a bit, critical theory or critical scholarship takes a look at the social system, what's going on here, what are the beliefs and practices that are keeping the status quo or inequities in place, and then says, now that we're aware of this, we can interrupt this. This is a critical approach, a very important approach to looking at this. A complexity thinking approach. So little seeds sprouting roots and leaves image here with this is to remind me to talk about the seed savers of the world and how they've really helped us to understand some of the basic tenets of complexity science or complexity thinking. That the seed savers of the world are saying, wow, all this monoculture, we need to be careful. We need to keep the genetic diversity in each seed so that when we have a drier summer or a wetter winter or a shadier place, that the seed has the diversity it needs to respond to the different environments. So that's a little bit of a setup there. So complexity thinking or complexity science or perspective has 4 very important aspects to it. The first 3 create a complicated system. So an image you can use is of the interior working of a clock. So there are many gears. So there's multiple diverse actors. They're different sizes, shapes, orientations, and they're connected. So the gears interlock, and when they turn, one gear turns, another gear turns, and so they're interdependent. That's a complicated system. The gears turn and the clock tells time, and it's very predictable. When you add the last piece, that complex systems, social systems, human social systems, and all biological systems essentially adapt. We learn, we have new ideas. In fact, that's what this whole institution is about, is bringing together new ideas. Right? So that makes for a complex system. That makes for much less predictability. And I find that far more helpful in thinking about the students in my classroom than another approach, the approach I discussed previously. So the third piece of this framework is transnational approach, which basically also connects with complexity thinking. And it also says we're located on this globe, this particular place in the universe, the planet Earth, and the international political, socio-political actions influence the local, but the local also influence the larger. And so it can be a way of reclaiming power, is to say that, yep, what I do locally really matters, and it might take a while, as we say in some anti-racism training, 500-year plan. But we can do it if we just keep doing it. So that's the transnational piece. And now, what if I apply this set of lenses, these 3 lenses, to the idea of disability? Is this really useful? So what a critical analysis reveals is that the social structures that are built on species typicality are the problem. We've said this is what's important to look at, and that's a problem. That creates injustice. And so we can generate what we can consider a emancipatory, a freeing social imaginary about how could we be in the world by using universal design, thinking about what if we developed a social system that really had access included for all of us, species typical and atypical, in the way we show up. So complexity science, as I just said with the seed saver piece, sees that species atypicality is the norm. That's just the way we show up. And in fact, diversity, species atypicality, is a parameter that strengthens the system, that provides resiliency to the system. So diversity is crucial to a strong social system. So that's helpful. The transnational piece, again, looking at the ways that the socio-political influences that some folks that I've been reading have called neo-colonialism, this new form of colonialism, where we say what we're doing in the West, this is the superior form, and so we're exporting our education approaches to Africa. Here, just do this. And I've become familiar with that process through a colleague in the program, Christina Court. We really are doing that a lot, and other things. So when I keep these three perspectives in mind then, as we work to understand this thing that we've come to call disability, it suggests that it is our negative attributions to species atypicality that is creating a system of discriminatory practices. It's basically it's our ontologies, and I'll talk more about that at a little bit here. So next screen, I'm shifting to Article 2, and I think I'm going to have to speed it up a little bit. Maybe not too much. Okay. So the title of this article is Disability Justice, Matters of Belief and Behavior. And we'll go right to the next slide. A paradigm is what we think about something before we even think about it. It's the belief system that's running around in the background. And the image here is of a grassy path. And so if we're moving along this grassy path and we see something coiled or squiggly in the grass, our first response might be we see a snake, right? And we might have a curious response, but more likely we might have a response of alarm. And then either way, that's going to direct our behavior. So if we're curious, we might become still so it doesn't go away, or we might creep toward it, right? If we're alarmed, we might grab something nearby and smack at it, or we might turn and run. So when we later find out that it's a rope, we might feel foolish. But nonetheless, our perceptions have impacted our excuse me, attitudes and thus our actions, and that goes full circle. So our beliefs guide. We believe that we might have seen a snake in the grass because we believe snakes live in the grass, or wander around in the grass. And that perception then drove our attitude. I'm alarmed, I'm curious. And then our behavior matched that attitude. Then we do something, and then we think, I must believe this because look what I just did. Right? That there's a reinforcement in that cycle of behavior. So beliefs are those operating systems that guide our cultural, our lived experience, and thus our cultural, what we make up as cultural. And then this understanding of beliefs and the way that they direct our behavior helps us to understand implicit bias or unconscious bias and the way that it can drive our behavior. So classic examples in kind of a racialized discourse is the white woman who clutches her purse when a brown person passes by. I might identify a male person who speaks his mind as an assertive person, and then I might think, wow, that woman is angry when she does the same thing. So there are attributions that we make based on belief systems, that maybe it's the exact same behavior, but we see it differently. And so what we need to do is become aware of our core beliefs and bring those out of the shadows, out of that non-conscious piece, and examine them and make some decisions about what we choose to believe, if they map onto our value system. So there are two narratives of disability that are very much alive and well in the world today. The first one is the dominant culture, we'll call it dominant culture paradigm or narrative storyline. Disability is an individual pathology. In the disability studies world, disability is a valued human diversity. Dominant culture says that disability is a problem, it requires modification, you got to fix it, you got to repress it, we don't want to deal with this. Disability study says disability is absolutely an experience that matters in terms of the context. So if I don't run into stairs and I'm using wheeled mobility and there's always an elevator, etc., I'm not disabled by the environment. Dominant culture says disability warrants pity or charity. Disability study says nope, it enhances the resiliency of social systems. We need to be more than welcoming. We need to seek out the perspectives of folks who have been perceived as disabled and include that in there, because we're going to have a stronger, better system when we do that. So basically, if we want justice, then we need to make an ontological shift, meaning we need to look at our core values. What do we understand about the being of human and our relationships with one another, and where do we go from there? So our ontologies might be considered kind of meta-paradigms, the larger paradigm that guides and supports and orchestrates the various other beliefs and smaller paradigms and ideologies that we have. So we need to ask who's benefiting, and do we appreciate this process, or do we want to make change? And that's the critical approach, right? All right, we might need to then renegotiate those ontologies. So what my study is going to addresses is that need to begin understanding what it is we think and where we want to go from there. So in the study, recognizing that each of those narratives guides a different future, I've said I'm opting for the one that cultivates justice. So I'm going to go with door number 2, please, disability allyship. And I've gone right to what I consider an important source, academia, that in terms of education, for sure, we teach teachers how to be teachers, and they teach kids, right? So there's this place where there's a source where ideas about how we show up are important. And then there's all this so-called knowledge production in all the departments and colleges and groups in this campus that are getting together and saying, hey, this is what I know, what do you know, and what do you think, and creating, producing knowledge. And certainly there are other places where knowledge is produced, but this is one of the places that it's considered most legitimated. And then also to explore this allyship in the context of academia, that the allies are the people I want to look at, that I want to work with, that the folks who have the unearned advantage are the folks who are in the majority at this point and often have those positions of influence for change. And so we'll talk more about that as we go. So my study then asked academics, faculty, and student affairs professionals, what is it? Let's see, sorry. What are your views of disability allyship? I did this through a method that I'll just very quickly describe. It's an approach that's designed to investigate the subjective experience of folks, and it identifies subjectivity as this internal frame of reference that we have. We make sense of the world. It assumes that this is measurable and uses the unit of psychological significance to measure it. And so up here I have the paper version of the Q sort that was used, 40 statements that I collected from people who identify as disabled and people who identify as disability allies. What is disability allyship? And arrange those. You're asked to arrange those in a, is this a lot like your view, your subjective experience of disability allyship, or a little less like, given the 40 statements that you had to work with? So I can talk more about the study overall. I have some slides at the end, but I'll just kind of cut to findings at this point and say what I found of interest. After doing the analysis, which has both a quantitative and a qualitative set of strategies to determine what we find, a 3-factor solution is the term in Q method, and there were 3 diverse or unique perspectives that also had some shared overlap. So the first was accountable collaborators. These folks are the folks who said, yep, we have to recognize the most important part of my view of allyship is that we recognize we're all normal and we all are accountable then for building the justice in the world. The third one, or second one, sorry, amicable, I'm trying to get to the end. Amicable empathic said it's most important that we are compassionate with one another. That's the most important aspect of disability allyship. And universal design advocates said, no, just get busy, change the environment, make it accessible, and all these problems go away. That's the most important. And so these viewpoints had some very particular differences, and there were some shared pieces as well. So what are the implications of this set of findings? That each viewpoint certainly was important, but it was partial. None of the viewpoints seemed to have all of the pieces of disability allyship that I didn't have a one-factor solution, that everybody had a similar view, right? Disability studies participant reviewers then looked at those three viewpoints and with the question, does this represent the way that disability allyship unfolds in the world? And they said yes, and let's be really clear, there's a couple of points of problem here because the statements included statements from lots of folks' perspectives about allyship. And the participant reviewers who came from a critical disability studies viewpoint said, there's some unconscious bias and stereotyping reflected in some of these statements, and you need to unpack that. So when a statement says, I support charitable groups in doing the work for people with disability, that signals that maybe there's a stereotype in place. If it says there's an expert that needs to respond to, maybe there's some, there's a need to look at that. So there were a couple of areas that, as we look at that framing of disability allyship, there's some work to do still in terms of what needs to be interrupted. So to say effective approaches then will amplify those areas of agreement and leverage their unique priorities. And this is something that I offer in the next chapter. I'll talk about that in just a moment. So there was some overlap in these pieces and these perspectives, sorry. But again, I guess I'll just move a little more quickly. The effective approaches need to amplify those areas of agreement and say, yep, we really do understand some similarities here, and then say, here's the differences and how do they all work together. And so that leads to Chapter 4, Article 3, and the application of these findings to academia. The slide is the spiral bound notebook, working it backwards, student success through faculty professional development. First draft of this article was developed by myself and Dr. Ray. So we've added quite a bit to this. And the basic idea is that a diverse faculty actually enhances the experience of students and the learning of students. So how do you get a diverse faculty? You need to create so also in this article really made the case for diversity needing to include disability because there's many ways that it kind of gets added on nowadays, but there's not a real deep analysis of disability, disableism. And then what I've offered in response to, okay, if you want to hold on to, if you want to recruit and retain a diverse faculty, then what do you need to pay attention to, especially if you're coming through the lens of disability? So I've offered the Accessibility, Climate, and Tenure Framework, which is just a slight morph from the work that the Forward program is doing. And wasn't it handy that it had that those three letters, right? And then I also offered in this article a blend of three professional development approaches that I've been involved in and really picked out key aspects of them that I found especially important and said, so here's the how, here's the what, the ACT framework, what to pay attention to, and here's the how of this professional development approach. So accessibility really works with universal design and embellishes on that, thinks about that a lot. Climate says, attention to climate says there needs to be this very explicit and ongoing commitment to equity. And tenure, because we're talking about faculty, and tenure is a part of faculty's lives, then flexible workplace policies. And again, these are policies that the Forward program has really already been working on. The blended critical andragogy, so pedagogy for kids, andragogy for adults. Just note that for the advocates program, which is part of the Forward program, that taking the gendered privilege and leveraging that to undo gender inequity is a really a gem of that approach. The RMAC curriculum, which was developed by Phyllis Mamachunda over at MSUM and a couple other folks, let's see, Emily Drew and Victor Rodriguez. So they co-developed this and have provided it to people in town here for a while. And their explicit intent in the workshop is you come here with the expectation that you're going to apply this understanding immediately to your courses. So this action piece. And then a SEED program is a seminar program I've been involved in for a long time. And the idea is that we need to keep coming back together and having these conversations because there's a lot to unlearn and a lot to learn. And so to take each of those pieces and integrate them into a full approach to undoing disability discrimination in an academic institution is the suggestion. And then I also offer in the article a very concrete suggestion and timelines and how to facilitate seminars and an appendices that have a year-long curriculum included. Chapter 5 then. So here we go. I'm going to tell you what I told you. I told you that there's a gap in our cultural awareness regarding the causes and consequences of disability. I said, gosh, I think conscientization, waking up to these systems is what needs to happen. That post-compulsory education is a very important place to start for many reasons, and I described a Hughes study that was accomplished to understand what allies are thinking about, and then linked that to student success, that if we want students to feel successful, we need to perhaps begin with faculty feeling successful and an approach for making that happen. My interpretation overall is that educationists, those of us in education, interested in education, that we are co-conspirators in the system that develops, that creates and maintains and perpetuates disadvantage based on perceptions of disability. And because we are those people, we are the ones we've been waiting for, we can also be co-conspirators in this cultural system that is congruent with our values. So, quickly, what can we do as individuals? We can change our language. So, in the same way that gay has been used over the years to signal derision, lame is a currently popular word to signal the same thing. Oh, that's so lame. It's a dismissive, disdainful attitude. So, of course, some of us are gay or genderqueer in some way, and some of us are lame in some way, and so to equate that with a problem is a problem. So we can speak to our peers and our students, and we can say, to characterize a whole group of people's experience as a problem, that's really a form of hate speech, and we're not going to do that. So we can have those kinds of conversations. I'm not gonna, you can't say lame around me. As in, you can't say that's so lame, right? We can also engage in conversations with one another about what these current education structures really represent, and does that map onto what we want to be doing. And we can claim our power for positive change, refusing hopelessness. This was part of Ann Bishop's 6 steps for becoming an ally. Her 6th step was, a hopeless ally is not an ally. So if you want to do allyship, you better have a hopeful perspective about what's possible. And finally, we can, in our classrooms, in our departments, in our institutions, mainstream critical disability studies approach and see where that takes us. So, whew. All right. So now we can have some conversation.
I'm going to come back up here so I can switch the camera back and forth. Any questions at this point?
I have a curiosity question. If you can imagine your school as having implemented many of these ideas and everyone got excited and became co-conspirators in the pursuit of justice, what might change? What are some examples of things that might change for the students on a day-to-day basis? If we had a camera and could look at those students in that imagined world, what might be different for them?
Might start with just an audio recorder, because one of the things that I hear really often that make me go, well, he's an Asperger, he's a spina bifida, she's that, that there's this shorthand way that we talk about students based on here's the window into them, and now they're characterized entirely as that. Right? That would change, I think, if we had this idea about the way that we label and the influences. So that would be my first response. And I think there would not be special education. I think we would have to say, wow, this puts it in place. This makes it happen. And there's been, there's 500-year plan. There's been this shift to something called response to instruction, and differentiating curriculum. That there are people that, good people, good educators that really are trying to grapple with this. But we are a long way from making really phenomenal changes, I think, in the system, unless, it all falls down and we start over. Thank you.
Should the committee ask questions, or are we supposed to hold off?
Feel free.
So what's the difference between identifying somebody that would thrive with specialized assistance and discriminating against somebody creating disadvantages?
I suppose my answer would be it's your ontology. So it's how you're approaching it, right? And that, I think, is what I'm saying, is the theory that we have about why we're doing it impacts the how that we do it, and the affective approach that we have to it, and people's experience of stigma or not. So how would it be different?
Can you give a concrete example of either of those?
Mm-hmm.
I guess the one that you want, the discrimination creating disadvantages.
Well, I don't know if this works, but I was at a so-called child study meeting, because we get together and we say, what do we need to do here? And then we do assessments, and we use that bell-shaped curve to tell us whether we meet criteria or not. And one of the teachers said, oh, I forgot my bell-shaped curve, because she's telling the parents where this kid stands, right? If we didn't use a bell-shaped curve there and say, here's normal, here's what your kids should be doing, right? If we said, actually I had a list of these statements that I called tells, disableism tells, which I'm not going to be able to dredge up now, but part of it is that languaging of naming a kid as the so-called categorical placement or health condition. So a concrete example. Instead of saying, so your child is in the very low average range in terms of their performance on this, I would say, so we see this continuum, and we see that in order for your child to be able to do this, we're going to work on this right now. There would just be a different, we'd be looking at a continuum in a different way. And sometimes educators do a pretty good job of that, and most of the time we don't. Did that answer you really, or are you just being nice?
Thank you.
Okay.
I think a great way of approaching that would be doing a comparative, or looking at comparative studies of how that's done in different cultures and different prejudices because we all seem to think from the American point of view, which is very strictly narrative in this standardization, and other cultures and other countries deal with that quite differently. For example, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, they work with students of a whole range of abilities in a different way than we do, and I think they have more success.
Okay.
So I would say international and competitive would be a great.
You would? Well, what a surprise.
Yeah, imagine that.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. We have a whole nother minute. Comments, questions? You know they're going to grill me when y'all leave.
With that, since it doesn't seem that there are other questions from the audience at this point, we will go ahead and end the first open portion. So we can get.
Please take some snacks on your way out. I don't want you to have to carry that.
And for the committee, we'll take about a 3 to 5 minute break while everybody's leaving, so if you can use the restroom or anything. Back here in about
4 to 7.
4 to 7,
Okay.
not 3 to 5.
In your home, including Peterson.
Leave that on.